Keep that A-10 out of the zone. She's just a girl in an iron pig. The operations officer's cold voice crackled through the radio. Below in the canyon, 381 Special Operations Forces were trapped tight, gasping desperately. The bunker door is welded shut. We're trapped in here. From high above, the female pilot said quietly, "I'll open the way. You are not authorized to fire." The order rang out. A streak of light dove down, explosion shaking the earth, dust and debris erupting. The massive door blasted open. The escape route was clear. The desert burned hot, even at night, and in the narrow mountain canyon, 381 Special Operations Forces huddled together with wounded soldiers and recently rescued prisoners, completely surrounded by enemy forces. The enemy had rigged explosives around the only bunker entrance, welded steel barriers to block the exit, and was preparing to pump poison gas into the underground shelter where the soldiers had taken refuge. The main character, Talia Reyes, a 33-year-old female pilot with jet-black hair pulled back in a tight knot, cold gray eyes that missed nothing, quiet by nature. Everyone called her Vox. High above in the desert sky, she piloted her heavy A-10 Thunderbolt, fully armed but ordered to fly patrol circuits outside the combat zone. No interference authorized. Over the communication channel, a male operations officer chuckled dismissively. "This isn't work for a girl in an A-10. Let the real pilots handle this. Down on the ground." A female communications specialist bleeding from a shrapnel wound in her arm pleaded desperately, "We're running out of oxygen. If we can't get this door open, everyone's going to die in here." Vox studied her targeting display, seeing the explosive wires running along the bunker door hinges, knowing she could neutralize them with surgical precision. Her years of training had prepared her for exactly this type of situation. But the orders from command were crystal clear. No weapons release authorized, because headquarters feared that any explosions might cause a complete cave-in that would kill everyone inside. The operations officer's voice continued over the radio, dripping with condescension. Female pilots should stick to transport missions, not combat operations. This requires precision that they simply don't possess. Vox listened to the chatter with growing frustration. She could see the tactical situation developing below, understood the physics of the explosive placement, and knew exactly how to solve the problem. But military protocol demanded that she follow orders, even when those orders might result in the deaths of hundreds of soldiers. Through her headset, she could hear the increasingly desperate voices from inside the bunker. "The air is getting thinner. Some of our people are already unconscious. If someone doesn't help us soon." She gripped the flight controls tighter, remaining silent, only saying one brief sentence, "I can see a way." The response from command was immediate and harsh. "Negative. Vox, you are not authorized to engage. Return to patrol altitude and maintain holding pattern." But Vox had spent years studying combat tactics, understanding the precise application of force required for different situations. She knew the difference between destruction and surgical intervention, and she could see exactly what needed to be done. The enemy forces below were moving fuel drums toward the bunker entrance, preparing to create a toxic smokescreen that would seep into the underground shelter. Time was running out for the trapped soldiers, and conventional rescue operations would take hours they didn't have. In her cockpit, Vox made mental calculations, studying the angle of attack needed to disable the welded barriers without causing structural collapse. Her A-10 was designed for exactly this type of precision ground support, but she would be directly disobeying orders to use it. Through the static, a hoarse voice from below reached her radio. "If you can hear this, don't let us suffocate in the darkness. We have families, people counting on us to come home." The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders. 381 lives hung in the balance, and she was the only person in position to save them. But doing so would mean ending her military career, facing court-martial, and accepting full responsibility for the consequences. As she circled above the canyon, Vox realized that some decisions transcended military protocol. Sometimes, doing the right thing meant accepting the personal cost of challenging authority. Inside the bunker, several soldiers had already collapsed from oxygen deprivation, while the remaining troops struggled to breathe through wet cloth filters. The underground shelter that had seemed like salvation was rapidly becoming a tomb. Enemy forces began pushing fuel barrels toward the bunker entrance, preparing to ignite a toxic smoke generator that would pump poisonous fumes into the sealed underground space. Their intention was clear. If they couldn't capture the soldiers, they would ensure none survived to report their operations. The operations officer's voice crackled over the radio with increasing authority. "No pilot is authorized to engage, especially not the female pilot. This situation requires experienced male pilots with proven combat records." Several voices joined in with mocking commentary. "Let the men handle this. She's probably too emotional to make the right decisions under pressure." Vox continued her silent observation, methodically noting every weakness in the rock wall structure, every vulnerable point in the enemy's defensive positions. Her training had taught her to see tactical opportunities that others missed. From below, the female communications specialist's voice grew weaker. "We don't have much time left. Please, trust that someone up there knows what they're doing." The mockery from command continued. "Female pilots are fine for cargo runs, but precision combat operations require steady nerves and years of experience that they simply don't possess." Vox had heard these arguments throughout her entire military career. Despite consistently outperforming male pilots in training exercises, despite demonstrating superior marksmanship and tactical awareness, she was still treated as an inferior pilot whose capabilities were questioned at every opportunity. But this wasn't about gender politics or career advancement. This was about 381 people who would die unless someone had the courage to act decisively. Through her targeting system, Vox could see the exact placement of the explosive wires, the structural weak points in the welded barriers, and the precise angle of attack needed to blast open the door without causing a cave-in. Her calculations were mathematically perfect, but command refused to trust her judgment. The voices from the bunker were becoming increasingly desperate. "Some of our wounded are going into shock from oxygen deprivation if we don't get fresh air soon." Operations Command issued another stern warning. Any pilot who engages without authorization will face immediate court-martial. The situation requires patience, not reckless action from inexperienced female pilots. Vox made her decision. She would accept full responsibility, knowing that her military career was about to end, but unable to listen to hundreds of soldiers die while she had the capability to save them. She keyed her microphone. "I'm going to target the explosive wires, not the bunker itself. Surgical precision. Minimal collateral damage." The response was immediate and furious. "If you're wrong, you'll kill all 381 people. Stand down immediately." But the soldiers trapped below had been listening to the radio chatter. Several voices spoke up. "Let her try. It's better than sitting here waiting to die. We trust her judgment. An older sergeant's voice cut through the static. I've been in combat for 20 years, and I'd rather trust a pilot who's willing to take responsibility than command officers who are afraid to make decisions. The operations officer's authority was being challenged by the very people he was supposed to be protecting. This is not a democracy. Orders are orders, regardless of what the trapped personnel want. But Vox was already lining up her first attack run. She had studied the target for minutes, calculated the precise force needed, and accepted the consequences of her decision. The time for debate had ended. The enemy forces below had noticed her circling pattern and were beginning to take defensive positions. They understood that the A-10 represented a significant threat to their operation, but they also knew that American pilots typically followed strict rules of engagement. What they didn't know was that Vox was about to break those rules. Through her headset, she could hear the labored breathing of soldiers whose oxygen was running out. Some were already unconscious. Others were struggling to stay alert as carbon dioxide levels rose in the sealed bunker. The fuel barrels were almost in position. Toxic smoke would begin pumping into the underground shelter within minutes. Once that process started, even opening the door wouldn't save the soldiers inside. Vox armed her weapon systems and began her descent toward the target. Her hands were steady, her calculations precise, her resolve absolute. She had spent years training for this moment, even though she had never expected it to come while disobeying direct orders. The operations officer made one final attempt to stop her. You are committing career suicide and potentially murdering hundreds of soldiers. Think about what you're doing. Vox's response was calm and professional. I am thinking about it. That's exactly why I'm doing this. The targeting computer locked onto the explosive wires. Her finger moved to the trigger. 381 lives depended on the next few seconds, and she was the only person willing to take the shot. Below, soldiers held their breath, knowing that their survival depended on the precision of a pilot whose capabilities had been questioned and dismissed by the very command structure that was supposed to support her. The moment of truth had arrived. Vox released her first guided munition with surgical precision, targeting the control box that managed the explosive detonation sequence. The small explosion disabled the entire network of mines, rendering them harmless and unable to trigger a chain reaction. Enemy forces on the ground panicked, firing wildly into the sky, while soldiers trapped in the bunker looked up with the first glimmer of hope they had felt in hours. She dove lower, her A-10's massive cannon roaring to life, targeting the upper hinges of the steel door with devastating accuracy. The sound of metal being torn apart echoed through the canyon as the reinforced barriers began to give way. The bunker door shuddered and shifted, creating a small gap that allowed the first fresh air to reach the suffocating soldiers inside. But the opening was still too narrow for escape, and the lower hinges remained intact. Vox continued her attack run, targeting the secondary anchor points that held the massive door in place. Sparks flew as armor-piercing rounds shredded the welded connections, but the door was only halfway open. Enemy forces had regrouped and were frantically trying to light their toxic smoke generators. Poisonous fumes began creeping toward the partially opened bunker entrance, threatening to kill the soldiers even as their escape route was being cleared. Vox faced a critical decision. The door was partially open, but not enough for 381 people to escape quickly. She needed to create a larger opening, but the only way to do that was to use explosive force that might bring down the entire rock face. Command was screaming over the radio. Abort immediately! You're about to cause a complete collapse. But Vox whispered into her microphone, "Too late for that now." She selected a precision-guided bomb and targeted the rock formation beside the bunker door. Calculating the exact force needed to use the explosion's pressure wave to blow the massive steel barrier completely off its remaining hinges, the bomb detonated with earth-shaking force. Dust and debris filled the air. But in the next instant, cheers erupted from below. "The exit is clear! Everyone out!" 381 soldiers poured out of the underground shelter, carrying wounded comrades, crying and laughing simultaneously as they breathed fresh air for the first time in hours. Enemy forces tried to set up defensive positions to prevent the escape, but Vox was already beginning her next attack run. Her cannon fire swept across their positions, and the fuel barrels they had been preparing to use against the soldiers exploded in massive fireballs, sending toxic smoke back toward the enemy forces instead. The reversal was complete and devastating. What had been a death trap for American soldiers had become a killing ground for enemy forces, who found themselves caught in their own poisonous smoke while under attack from above. The operations officer who had been mocking Vox just minutes earlier was now stammering over the radio. Outstanding, absolutely outstanding work. His authority had evaporated, replaced by grudging admiration for the pilot who had ignored his orders and saved hundreds of lives. Soldiers on the ground were laughing through their tears. "Did you hear that? Now he has to call her commander, instead of just the girl in the A-10. But Vox wasn't finished. Enemy reinforcements were approaching the canyon, trying to cut off the soldiers' escape route. She methodically destroyed their vehicles, cleared their defensive positions, and maintained air superiority until rescue helicopters could arrive. The tactical situation had shifted completely. What had been a hopeless rescue operation had become a textbook example of close air support, executed with precision that would be studied in military academies for years to come. As the last of the soldiers were loaded onto evacuation helicopters, radio chatter from other aircraft in the area reflected their amazement. "Never seen anything like that precision bombing run. That pilot just rewrote the manual on urban combat operations." Ground forces were equally impressed. "She didn't just save our lives. She turned a massacre into a victory. That A-10 pilot is a legend." The operations officer, who had initially refused to authorize her mission, was now filing reports that praised her exceptional tactical judgment and outstanding courage under pressure. The same man who had dismissed her as just a girl was now recommending her for commendation. Enemy forces in the area had been completely routed. Their carefully planned ambush had been turned into a devastating defeat, all because one pilot had been willing to disobey orders and trust her own judgment about what the situation required. The rescue helicopters reported successful extraction of all personnel, with significantly fewer casualties than had been expected. Medical teams were amazed that most of the soldiers were in good condition, despite their extended captivity in the sealed bunker. Military historians would later analyze this operation as a perfect example of individual initiative overcoming institutional bureaucracy. One pilot's willingness to accept personal responsibility had prevented what could have been one of the worst disasters in special operations history. But for Vox, the mission wasn't about making history or proving points about gender equality in combat. It was simply about doing what needed to be done when lives were at stake, regardless of the personal consequences. As she circled the canyon one final time, ensuring that all soldiers had been safely evacuated, she reflected on the chain of events that had led to this moment. Years of training, months of questioning her capabilities, and, ultimately, seconds of decision-making that had determined whether hundreds of people lived or died. The radio crackled with messages of gratitude from the rescued soldiers. Unknown, A-10 pilot. You saved our lives today. We'll never forget what you did for us. Operations Command, now completely supportive of her actions, cleared her for return to base. Vox, outstanding mission completion. All personnel successfully evacuated. Enemy forces neutralized. Well done. The transformation in their attitude was complete. The pilot they had refused to trust with combat operations was now being praised as one of the most effective close air support pilots they had ever worked with. As Vox headed back toward base, she knew that her military career had just taken a dramatic turn. The court-martial she had expected was now unlikely, replaced by commendations and recognition for exceptional service under pressure. But more importantly, 381 soldiers were heading home to their families instead of dying in a sealed bunker. That outcome made every risk she had taken, every order she had disobeyed, completely worthwhile. The desert canyon was quiet now, but the story of what had happened there would be told for years to come. When the rescue helicopters departed with the last of the soldiers, Vox landed her A-10 at the forward operating base. The aircraft that had been dismissed as an iron pig piloted by just a girl was now being regarded with something approaching reverence. The operations officer who had mocked her capabilities approached across the flight line. His face red with embarrassment as other personnel watched. The man who had refused to authorize her mission just hours earlier was now forced to face the pilot who had proven him completely wrong. He swallowed his pride and saluted. I was wrong. Thank you for saving them. The admission was public, witnessed by dozens of ground crew and support personnel who had heard his earlier dismissive comments over the radio. His authority had been undermined by his own poor judgment, while Vox's reputation had been cemented by her exceptional performance. Soldiers who had been rescued from the bunker ran across the tarmac to meet her. Several placed unit patches from their uniforms into her gloved hands, a traditional gesture of respect and gratitude. They began calling her A-10 the Doorbreaker, a nickname that would follow her for the rest of her career. Vox didn't seek the attention or glory. Her response was characteristically brief. They're alive. That's enough. In the base cafeteria, no one took photographs or made speeches. Instead, personnel quietly placed bottles of water and energy bars in front of her. Simple gestures of thanks that meant more than any formal ceremony could have provided. The radio chatter that had been filled with dismissive comments about the girl in the hog disappeared completely. Pilots throughout the theater of operations had heard about her precision bombing run, and word was spreading that she had just executed one of the most difficult close air support missions in recent military history. Maintenance crews worked with unusual care on her aircraft, understanding that they were servicing a machine that had just saved hundreds of lives. The A-10 that had been viewed as obsolete was now seen as a precision instrument in the hands of an exceptional pilot. Young female pilots at other bases began requesting copies of the mission reports, using Vox's tactical decisions as case studies in their own training. She had become proof that gender was irrelevant when it came to combat effectiveness and tactical judgment. The rescued communications specialist, her arm now properly bandaged, sought out Vox to express her gratitude. You didn't just save our lives. You showed everyone what we're capable of when people stop underestimating us. But perhaps the most significant change was in the operations officer's behavior. The man who had initially refused to trust female pilots with combat missions was now quietly revising procedures to ensure that all qualified pilots, regardless of gender, would be given equal consideration for critical operations. social media posts from soldiers' families began appearing, thanking the A-10 pilot who brought our loved ones home. The story was spreading beyond military circles, inspiring people who had faced similar discrimination in their own careers. Military leadership was taking notice. Vox's tactical innovation and willingness to accept responsibility under pressure were exactly the qualities they wanted to see in their officer corps. What had begun as an act of insubordination was being reframed as exceptional leadership. The base commander called her into his office, not for disciplinary action, but to discuss her future assignments. He wanted to ensure that her talents were properly utilized, rather than wasted on routine patrol missions. As evening fell over the desert base, the atmosphere had fundamentally changed. Conversations that had once focused on gender and capabilities were now centered on tactical effectiveness and mission success. The woman who had been marginalized and dismissed was now being consulted on complex operations planning. Her voice carried weight that had been earned through demonstrated competence rather than granted through rank or political considerations. The official mission report stated simply, "Target successfully neutralized. Escape route opened for all personnel." No mention was made of the initial resistance to authorizing the mission or the gender-based discrimination that had nearly prevented it from happening. Aircraft maintenance crews quietly painted "Door Breaker" on the side of her A-10, a designation that would remain with the aircraft for the rest of its service life. The nickname became a symbol of precision and reliability among ground support pilots. Vox visited the base medical facility to check on the soldiers who had been rescued. Seeing a young soldier sleeping peacefully, she simply pulled his blanket up and left without waking him. Her satisfaction came from their survival, not from recognition of her role in achieving it. The operations officer who had initially dismissed her capabilities was now writing training materials for the military academy, including a case study titled "Individual Initiative in Combat Operations, When Personal Judgment Supersedes Protocol." Late that night, Vox sat outside her quarters looking across the quiet desert. A fellow pilot approached and sat beside her, saying simply, "Thank you. Because of you, they're still breathing." She smiled slightly and replied, "I talked too much today already." The comment reflected her character perfectly. Even after proving herself in the most dramatic way possible, she remained focused on the mission rather than personal recognition. Her actions spoke louder than any words could have. Military academies began incorporating her mission into their curriculum, not as an example of insubordination, but as a case study in tactical decision-making under pressure. Her willingness to accept personal responsibility for difficult decisions became a model for future officers. The soldiers she had rescued carried her story with them throughout their careers. Many went on to become senior leaders who remembered the lesson about trusting competence over assumptions. Their experiences influenced a generation of military personnel who were more willing to recognize capability regardless of who demonstrated it. Aviation forums and military blogs discussed her precision bombing techniques, with experienced pilots acknowledging that her tactical approach had been both innovative and flawlessly executed. She had raised the standard for close air support operations. Female pilots throughout the military found their own opportunities expanding as commanders became more willing to assign combat missions based on demonstrated ability rather than gender-based assumptions. Vox's success had opened doors for others to follow. The story spread beyond military circles, inspiring people in civilian careers who had faced similar discrimination and dismissal. Her example showed that sometimes proving yourself requires taking calculated risks and accepting responsibility for the consequences. Years later, when military historians studied the evolution of gender equality in combat operations, They would point to this mission as a turning point where capability trumped prejudice in the most dramatic way possible. Some doors can only be opened when someone has the courage to trust their own abilities, even when everyone else doubts them. If you believe in stories that touch the heart like this one, leave a comment. And don't forget to subscribe to SN Quiet Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten. Real people are creating and telling stories, not mass-produced AI.